Welcome to the film analysis. Today with Don't Worry Darling by Olivia Wilde. This film will not be a flash in the pan. It will be one of those works that we keep referring to, questioning, and it will continuously give us answers. Harry Styles plays Jack Chambers. Florence Pugh plays Alice. They are a couple, married and living in America, in a secret place surrounded by a desert. It is a community. This is called the Victory Project, a deceptive 50s idyll. The convertibles are always polished, the front yards manicured, the gentlemen wear plaid suits with narrow ties, and the ladies exquisite cocktail dresses. The gentlemen are engaged in a secret gainful occupation, the manufacture of progressive materials, as they call it, while the ladies, as housewives and mothers, feather their nests. In between, they go on a shopping spree in a mall. At some point, the couples must have followed the call of Frank, played by Chris Pine, who represents the charismatic boss of this project. Frank keeps showing up to give motivational speeches, telling the residents that they are special. They stood up against the chaos of the world and created a new order in which control is good. Even control over one's one body. In ballet classes, the ladies practice this very order. Synchronized movements are capitalized, and the film also dazzles us with these movements again and again in this film. May we too be able to experience this beautiful synchronicity, resembling revue films or Esther Williams films from that time. Barely a scene occurs without music from that time. Speeches urgently ring out from the radio. Speeches by Chris, by Frank, in which he explains once again what it is all about. The mass medium radio spreads this ubiquitous ideology. To be more precise, the housewives fail to recognize the ideology. They are like fish in the water without thinking about being in the water. Alice, however, suddenly notices that one of the residents is not at all happy to be part of this project. But this woman is prevented from speaking her mind. At some point, this woman disappears. What is going on with her? It dawns on Alice. Something is wrong. Why are people only allowed to move within a limited radius and not to deviate from the road? Why is criticism of Frank dismissed? Why is the project secret, and what is her own husband concealing? In short, what Alice is being sold as utopia could be a dystopia. We know many films in which individuals fight against a totalitarian order. This tradition is close to Don't Worry Darling. The references to today are striking. Even the title is not meant in a particularly malicious way. One could say, all is well, don't worry darling, everything seems fine. This paternalistic gesture runs through the film, this don't worry darling. Even what Frank, the boss of it all, states is by no means only to be understood in the sense of a disciplinary and honorary order. But it is sometimes also very kindly delivered. I would like to invite you to be a part of this project. Those phrases are familiar to us. I would like to invite them to understand, meaning you must not contradict. Expressions like we are all in this together exclude any arguments in advance. The chosen phrases of Frank and the other men illustrate how Olivia Wilde beautifully exposes this new paternalistic speech. At the same time, there is a fascistic element when it is repeatedly asked, to whom does the world belong? And everyone answers in chorus, it belongs to us. At the same time, however, Frank speaks in code. He speaks of the unleashing of potential, and Alice and the other women are also caught up in this logic. Thus, when she becomes too critical, she quickly returns and promises, I will do better. We also experience this everywhere today. We observe on the one hand the optimization mania and on the other hand continuously experience permanent learning. Even nowadays one always says, I will improve again, I will get ahead again, I still have a lot to learn. Olivia Wilde does not make it difficult for us to draw references to the present. That's also due to the view of this model city. Although we find a historically accurate 50s setting, many things remind us of films from that time, including nostalgic films from today, taking us back to the 50s once again. In addition, many TV shows are set in the 50s and 60s. The camera, however, often circles around these characters in an irritatingly restless way. We see mainstream images of them from an unusual perspective, especially as Alice's mistrust grows. Everything is too perfect. The frozen smiling doctor who is supposed to treat Alice, the eternal tootling from the radio. Immediately, in a moment of silence, a new record is put on by one of the husbands, breaking the silence. Of course, this reminds us of our strong connection to technical devices nowadays. In the present, too, there is hardly any interruption. The show must go on. One is guided to press even further on the smartphone, not to turn off the laptop. Strikingly, this 50s project consists of quite diverse characters that might make us wonder if it could be real. We may interpret this film in two directions. In the direction primarily given by the film, one could say we are dealing with an undoubtedly good film. But if we take another direction, Don't Worry Darling will prove to be an even better film. Be advised, we can't avoid spoilers now. We must give away a crucial twist. Throughout the film, briefly cut images characterized by a different aesthetic flash on screen, we can assume they are inside Alice's mind. We see Jack, but he looks a bit different, a bit more unkempt. The film only seemingly takes us back to the 50s. And many viewers who keep longing for these images, who also enjoy this glossy aesthetic, they have already fallen into the trap. Alice tries to dig further and further to a truth. She tries to unveil a secret, and suddenly, in about the last quarter of the film, we see unadorned dark images and we realize all at once, no, this film is not set in the 50s. This film is set in the present, is set in our world. Alice has been kidnapped. She actually works as a doctor in a hospital, has very long shifts. She hardly has time for her relationship with her boyfriend Jack, but her boyfriend can't even manage to cook something for both of them in the evening. Instead, he watches YouTube videos of a masculinity coach, Frank. This Frank works as the CEO of a project that wants to bring order to chaos, meaning the social changes that have come about because of emancipation. It is no coincidence that the film focuses on this term chaos several times, that Frank uses this term. Jordan Peterson shapes this very term. He conflates it with femininity, with emancipation. And in Jordan Peterson we find the promise of male order. Frank doesn't just preach incel content, though he promises a way out, says, I have a project here that you can participate in. Let's establish an orderly world with the help of the Victory Project. What does it look like? Well, participating men must see that they get their women tied up. The women are exposed to electric shocks, deliberately reminiscent of the therapies given to homosexuals in the 1950s to convert them to heterosexuality. At the same time, the women's eyes are torn open to force other images into them. And the men also take part in this program, although voluntarily. They lie down and let themselves be wired up. Afterwards, we join the virtual reality we have previously witnessed for 3/4 of the film. Here, the film revisits red pill thinking and turns the matrix around. The virtual world becomes the desirable one. With eyes pulled open, reference to Clockwork Orange of course, they lie on the bed. They are led into what philosopher Zygmunt Bauman called retrotopia. Retrotopia. And in doing so, one is performing the Great Regression, thus re-establishing a gender order from the 50s. It's also reminiscent of Silicon Valley. If we consider people like Peter Thiel declaring retrotopia thoughts in a new guise. The Victory Project still requires the gender order. The men know about everything while the women are left ignorant. They don't know what is going on. Allegorically, Don't Worry Darling tells of the rabbit hole which Jack and many more men go down, and they consciously decide to put on their manhood Truman Show. Now you might say, that's just the zeitgeist. Hollywood is picking up on that a lot right now. Toxic masculinity and the like. Well, is that comparable to films like Alex Garland's Man or Edgar Wright's Last Night in Soho, for example? Granted, both have their difficulties. Both films basically depict men as pigs. Now, it is not a matter of being offended by such a statement. More importantly, the movie's argument matters. Men behave that way by nature. This is the clear message of these works, denying any change. The gender struggle is thus an eternal one. It cannot be overcome. Some are like this, others like that, but patriarchy is historically conditioned. And patriarchy can also dissolve, or at least become weaker, if you compare Western societies with patriarchal structure in Saudi Arabia, for example. Olivia Wilde shows us precisely this historical aspect, the creation of the patriarchal order by having the 50s recreated as a Truman Show, as a red pill fantasy. Jake and the men erect a construction and thus nothing natural, which is sold here as order in chaos. The remarkable thing is that Alice now thinks based on mirror details. This can't be it. This life she's living. Yes, they have sex regularly, they have enough money at their disposal, but it's not just individual incidents that make Alice think, but Alice observes and asks herself again and again, is this the life I want to lead? This leads us to the second interpretation. The film gives us the previous one. One could also ask, why is it that if we leave aside this last quarter, Alice is in the right? If you ride on the highway and at some point there are only cars coming towards you, you should think about whether you are perhaps driving on the wrong side and not the others. But aren't you making it a bit too easy for yourself with such a statement? You could almost suppose Alice to be a conspiracy theorist. It's not until the last quarter of the film that we viewers learn what's really going on. Let's forget about that plot twist for a moment, though. The latter one includes Jack kidnapping Alice, but we must put ourselves in Alice's shoes here. She doesn't sit in the movie theater, watch the last quarter and understand everything, but Alice rather works out this last quarter for us. Excluding the twist, what are we supposed to think of the 50s society? How does it affect us and how does Alice's behavior affect us? In the first 3 quarters, one might as well understand the film as an emancipatory pioneer story. Alice as an early protagonist of the women's movement. Now that would certainly be entirely possible, but we as viewers might also be able to comprehend the other inhabitants' stance and judge Alice to be sick. We could perhaps suppose Alice to be a lateral thinker, always contradicting the consensus, but this proves to be misleading. As irritating as it is, we should ask ourselves why Alice should be right, or rather, is Alice's behavior right, as the depicted society obviously agrees with these rules? Doesn't Alice realize that everyone seems happy? People fare much worse in other parts of the country. Is Alice just being unruly? Let's say the film is set in the 1950s. It's a brilliant idea. Social acceptance was indeed in the 50s almost as depicted in the film. Wilde refers to the 50s very cleverly here, because one should ask, how does Alice legitimate her right to resist? That's quite the philosophical question. Alice experiences conformity in her environment. This very pressure to conform becomes stronger the more Alice questions and contradicts. Alice wants to think for herself. She is following Immanuel Kant and his essay, What is Enlightenment?, where he declares that one should have courage to use one's own mind. Alice does not only stand for an emancipatory women's movement, but stands for all of us. Even if there is a consensus, a conformity, the film calls on us to have the courage to think for ourselves. Us identifying with Alice renders the film excellent. Simply reducing it to its twist doesn't do the film justice. Rather, we experience a protagonist who suddenly embraces the courage to think, to express criticism, to gain access to knowledge, to accept no secret, to want to know what is being researched out there in the desert. As in Kant, access to knowledge conditions the Enlightenment, separating Alice decisively from climate deniers or conspiracy theorists. While the latter may appear to resist the consensus, they have cut the connection to knowledge, to the science. They try to assert something counterfactually. It's different with Alice. She is exposed to a high conformity pressure. The sciences are not free of pressure to conform either, of course. A few weeks ago, the NASA head of research was asked in an interview about images from space which prove, or at least suggest to us, that perhaps we are not completely alone in space. He states, yes, he is glad that there is now more talk about it, because these images have existed for a long time and a certain shame existed among the researchers, a fear to express oneself. We learned that in science too there is conformity pressure, at times preventing the truth to be spoken. We find the behavior of men in the movies from the 50s offensive, because nowadays, as they like to say, we are much further along. After all, it is consensus that women are allowed to work today. Our economies would collapse if they didn't. But is it enough to admit that we are much further along today? We won't get anywhere with consensus, or rather, this kind of thinking leads us into a predicament. We can ask ourselves which social consensus denies other people, other opinions, other minorities and other freedoms to flourish. We must understand, Don't Worry Darling is by no means only critical of Jordan Peterson fans, but criticizes liberalism. The liberal idea today is based on consensus. People try to establish consensus, and when a society has agreed on consensus, it is possible to live within that framework. But what about truth? There must be something fundamentally true that cannot be questioned. If that does not exist, we fall into arbitrariness, leading us to say, yes, I also know what Alice means, but the others have obviously agreed to live together peacefully and enjoy a certain prosperity. Although we know in the end it is different and they have not all decided of their own free will. But at least the inhabitants were always spared ideological indoctrination and so on. Let's pretend for once that everyone is indeed perfectly okay with such a world being lived in, which is based on men and women not being equal, this liberal idea that you just must retreat to consensus and that you don't need a metaphysical truth is criticized by philosopher Omri Boehm in his outstanding book Radical Universalism. He writes, after liberalism discarded the Kantian idea of man as absolutist and metaphysical, people no longer commanded the categorical dignity this idea implies. This may be fine for the broad majority, whose humanity is usually assumed, but minorities are thus deprived of the abstraction that has a higher authority than common sense. The shared experiences, interests, or consensually adopted legitimate laws of the majority. And as irony or tragedy would have it, progressives confuse a unionist democracy with a Kantian universalism and therefore adopt the idea of man rather than return to it. End of quote. That is, after all, an argument of progressives today. Well, those are some old white man's ideas of days long gone. Therefore, they prove to be untrue. However, if we aim at metaphysical truth, and we will refer to Kant in a short while, we will discover an ineluctable essence, not relating to any historical context, by the likes of Kant being in Prussia or something else. According to liberal logic, the world shown in the film could simply be based on a consensus, which only now one individual has recalcitrantly resisted. Alice. Should she perhaps be, to use another word, cancelled? For some time now, we have seen arguments counting less and less in debates. Instead, people refer to the speaker's identity. It's all about creating a consensus in the respective bubble. This connects right-wingers and left-wing identity politics and, at the same time, identity politics with bourgeois liberalism. Omri Böhm clearly says, where all thoughts amount to the same, false ones are as good as true ones. But since an independent standard of truth contradicts this equality, it is abolished and replaced by something that all can agree on, consensus. It leads to the liberal belief conceding insight and wisdom rather to the many than to the few, sorting out those few who might follow the truth and contradict the general opinion as fanatics. This could easily be applied to Alice. She is a fanatic according to the project's inhabitants. They portray Alice as a fanatic, as a hysteric. We should understand this not only as a reference to the 50s, but also as a debate contribution to current forms of cancel culture. Omri Böhm continues, the danger of such conformism, to which Tocqueville refers, is that it enables the desires of the majority to be enforced not only by means of physical threats or state power in the style of earlier tyrants, as we witness with the project when violence makes such an obvious appearance, but Omri Böhm writes, as legitimate authority. As soon as the higher metaphysical authority of truth is denied, the only standard that can confer legitimacy is the standard on which all agree, or at any rate all who are included. End of quote. At first, all seem included except for Alice. Afterwards, it turns out that everyone is included except for the women. That's what's interesting about the character Alice. She is always said to be hysterical, sick, not healthy. She's supposed to use her common sense. It reminds me of an episode a good friend recently told me about. He is working on a screenplay involving a major international film studio. During the Zoom calls on the script, the studio kept saying that their compliance department would probably not be satisfied with it, or that the compliance department would certainly object to it. At some point, my friend asked, but what are the rules of this compliance department anyway? He was told, well, they just follow common sense. It is also fitting that in the film a psychiatrist doubts Alice's well-being, that she must be led back to the healthy path. In truth, however, Alice had a freedom inside her. And this freedom must be expressed under any circumstance. But that is difficult. This burden is represented by the electric shocks, by the ideological indoctrination with the radio standing for our mass media, even if we are not connected with electrodes all the time. Electronic devices do accompany us everywhere. Why is the man's treatment of the women objectively wrong? Of course, if we think about the end, women are not allowed to decide probably at all. They were kidnapped. They do not know what really happened to them. The illustrated order proves wrong in other terms, as these women only live for the man's fulfillment, the former enabling the latter's lives. This leads us to Kant's absolute truth, a metaphysical truth which cannot be circumvented. Kant writes in the fundamental principles of the metaphysics of morals, act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. But the former happens with the film's women. They are used as means or even abused to an end for men. If later a woman says to Alice, look, I've been initiated for a long time. I know about it, but I feel good this way. It's all good. Alice must contradict, of course. It is still wrong, even if she thinks she has come to terms with it. Omri Böhm writes at one point, an unjust law is no law at all. And so Jack's argumentation proves to be incomprehensible as well when he says to Alice, think about it, you used to work for days, had 30-hour shifts. Here we grant you a pleasant life after all, but she insists on her freedom. Here too, the reference to today exists. We see in many cases that men encourage their partners to join, say, OnlyFans, open accounts. Men state, it will allow you to escape the hamster wheel of gainful employment wonderfully. But to what extent are they actually still free? We are currently experiencing a great algorithmic consensus being established. We are experiencing a social pressure, a uniform life with consensus opinions. In one of 3 places, each of the project's couples went on their honeymoon. They spent their vacations on the same beaches each time, and they go to know each other in roughly the same way. It's reminiscent of Instagram, of our dating apps. This is where the ideology critique comes in. We are also exposed to images. In this film, the eye is opened wide so the ideology may enter the head. This film leads us as viewers down the garden path. We ourselves very quickly fall in love with beautiful 50s images, including retro cars and retro chic. Cinema seduces us with these bodies, synchronized movements with this supposed perfection. Olivia Wilde gives us a bitter red pill here, so that we not only watch, but see. It would be nice if you would like to support the film analysis financially. You can do so via my bank account or PayPal. Also, you can find me on Patreon. Thank you very much.